Losing Ground. Life's issue of April 24, 1950 was the usual potpourri, the wedding of Franco's daughter, and a lavish pictorial on the art of El Greco, an analysis of foreign policy by John Foster Dulles, and a story on Bob Hope's first television show. The magazine looked up from its perusal of these matters long enough to editorialize on the state of the economy. Life liked what it saw. 4 years ago, the editors wrote, the U.S. was hip-deep in a post-war boom, and the news today is that it is still smack in the middle of the same boom. The darned thing goes on and on and on. The writers expanded at some length on this theme, happily cataloging the achievements of American free enterprise. The editorial closed with a cautionary note. Mindless materialism was a growing threat. The life of the spirit, through the arts, science, and religion, was the real point of it all, the editorial reminded. Too many people were forgetting that. Are the American people really coming to value prosperity as a means to the larger good? Life asked. The editorial did not mention poverty. It did not mention that an entire race of Americans was still consigned to second-class status. It did not mention the possibility that prosperity and the larger good were equally unreal to millions. Life was not alone. In that year of transition from the first half of the century to the second, the leading popular magazines Time, Newsweek, the Saturday Evening Post, Look, Collier's, the Reader's Digest, contained very little about social or economic injustice. The Negro problem? There was a Supreme Court decision in June of 1950, ruling that the University of Oklahoma could not require its one black student to sit alone in a separate part of the dining hall, and that the University of Texas could not claim that the law school it set up exclusively for a black student was really separate but equal, consisting as it did of a single room. But the court did not repudiate the underlying separate but equal doctrine. Civil rights advocates were disappointed, but the New York Times counseled patience. This republic cannot recognize degrees of citizenship, its editors wrote. But as long as considerable numbers of people, including the majority or dominant elements of whole communities, think differently, we cannot expect the millennium. The editorial in the nation's most prestigious newspaper did not ask for a stronger stand by the court or urge new civil rights legislation. Rather, the editors concluded, the situation calls for a period of education. How long a period, no one can say. At the end of the year, the American Civil Liberties Union released its survey of newspapers in 16 major cities, revealing that, although political and academic freedoms were imperiled, there were bright spots. Labor rights, press freedoms, and race relations were in a healthy state. Poverty was so far from being a topic of concern that the lack of poverty was said to be creating, if not exactly a problem, at least a challenge. Philanthropists would have to start being more creative in finding useful things to do with their money, wrote the head of one large foundation, now that most of the crushing burden of relieving destitution has been removed from the shoulders of the individual giver to those of society, where it belongs. 4. Two of the scarce references to poverty are instructive. The first was in a small journal which was at that time well to the left on the American political spectrum, the New Republic. In a 15-page State of the Union editorial with which it opened the new year, the magazine included a subsection entitled The Lowest Third, referring to the 10 million American families who earn less than $2,000. But the writers could not muster much indignation. The subsection on the lowest third was buried in the middle of the editorial. The word poverty was not used. Prologue. Tie-ins for reform were modest, acknowledging that of the causes for the condition of the lowest third are beyond the power of any Congress to solve. The magazine asserted only that many of the unskilled could do better if given the chance. The New Republic's prescription was for the president to create a special commission on labor training, a national scholarship program, and a fair employment practices commission. A second exception to the general silence on the topic was a piece in the June issue of Harper's. Robert L. Heilbronner, a Harvard economist, had written a lengthy article entitled, Who Are the American Poor? A little note at the bottom of the first page introduced him and then added a reassurance. In calling attention to one of the imperfections of our economy, he assumes a basic condition of health which can withstand examination. 6. Heilbronner's analysis should have been a shocker. He reminded his readers of the economic plight of the elderly, Negroes, and farmers. He discussed how the poverty level might be defined, and he eventually reached estimates of poverty that ranged from a quarter to a third of the entire U.S. population, depending on the definition and statistics one used. His numbers were accurate. Retrospectively applying the official definition of poverty, the one now employed by the federal government, the news media, and scholars when they discuss poverty, there were in 1950 approximately 45 million American poor, or 30% of the population. By the standards of 30 years later, the United States was in the midst of a crisis of poverty, but hardly anyone noticed. If by subsequent standards the poverty problem was appallingly large, the federal effort to deal with poverty was irresponsibly puny. In 1950, social welfare spending for the general public cost a little over $3 billion, about $11 billion in 1980 dollars. This figure includes Social Security, aid to families with dependent children, unemployment insurance, the entire federal effort. In a country with 45 million living in poverty, it represented an annual expenditure of less than $250 per poor person. 1968. At the outset of 1968, the expansive confidence of 1950 would have been much more justifiable. Real gross national product had risen for 9 straight years, and the increases added up to a boom. Inflation had been held to an average of only 1.6% during those same 9 years. Real income, fringe benefits, job security all had been improving. For the poor who had been so ignored in 1950, unemployment was gone. That is, the unemployment rate was running at 3.6%, which economists considered to be tantamount to full employment. Their assessment could be validated at nearly any factory or union hiring hall, or in the help wanted signs in the windows of restaurants and stores and gas stations and repair shops. If you wanted a job, presumably jobs could be had. Not only the economy had boomed, the nation had moved dramatically to rid itself of discrimination and disadvantage. In the 4 years of the Johnson administration, Congress had passed into law landmark legislation in civil rights, medical care, housing, education, and job training. The Office of Economic Opportunity was a new and active force for urban renewal, community development, drug rehabilitation, alternatives for juvenile delinquents, and experimentation with solutions for just about every other known social problem. In the courts, the poor and uneducated were winning legal protections that previously had been enjoyed largely by people with the money to hire good lawyers. Constitutional precepts, separation of church and state, one man, one vote, protection against self-incrimination, to name a few, were being interpreted with unprecedented literalism and applied with unprecedented scope. There was reason for satisfaction, but very little of it. The prevailing spirit ranged from determination to despair. Vietnam was part of the reason, of course, but hindsight can easily distort our memories of what happened when. As 1968 began, the Tet Offensive, generally accepted as the pivotal event in American public perceptions of the war, was still in the future. Cambodia and Kent State were more than 2 years away. Roxbury and Newark, in which riots broke out in the summer of 1967, and more recently Detroit, with 43 dead and 4 days of violence, had been battlefields closer to home. In its lead editorial for the first issue of 1968, entitled, "Forebodingly, Will We Make It?" the New Republic's most strident rhetoric was reserved for the domestic situation. We no longer ask whether there will be mass violence and racial war next summer, but whether it will break out sooner, the editors wrote. To respond constructively would be to see what we are, and to admit that the United States, its immense wealth and managerial technology notwithstanding, has slipped out of rational control. Real reform could then begin. Prologue. Real reform? What, if not real reform, had been going on for the past 4 years? But the editors of the New Republic were not alone in dismissing the progress to date. 2 months into the new year, the President's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, comprising some of the most distinguished public servants, academicians, and businessmen in the nation, would release its report. It would recommend emergency legislation to create FWO million new jobs, lest the deep frustrations of the poor push them to more desperate measures to pry action from an unresponsive system in an economy with an unemployment rate of 3.6%. From complacency in the face of want to hysteria in a time of plenty. In 18 years, the public perception of what was happening had done an about-face. 1981. During the 1970s, the poor receded from public attention. Their plight was invoked when it had to be, as the justification for new and expanded social programs. But they were at the periphery of our national concerns, presumably taken care of, more or less. Within 3 months of Ronald Reagan's inauguration on January 20, 1981, the poor were once more at center stage. A budget crisis was upon us, and something had to give. In the administration's view, the social welfare programs were prime targets for budget cuts. An intense debate began over what could be done without ripping the social safety net. Conservatives wanted to save money without causing pain and argued that only fat was being excised from overgrown programs. Liberals insisted that this was wishful thinking. The editors of Commonweal described the basis of their fear. It is true that many of the targets of the budget cuts will be only marginally affected. Often enough, however, that may be the crucial margin that sustains the spirit, if not even the body. Some people will make do by slipping into alcoholism, by taking out their rage on their neighbors and passers-by, and then filling our prisons, by neglecting or abusing children and passing social costs on to another generation. Far more will make do by simply suffering quietly. Both sides proceeded from a tacit common premise that the important progress of recent years should be preserved. Few asked the questions it would seem natural to start with: how much progress in fact has been made? How have the poor been doing? The unadorned statistic gives pause. In 1968, as Lyndon Johnson left office, 13% of Americans were poor, using the official definition. Over the next 12 years, our expenditures on social welfare quadrupled. And, in 1980, the percentage of poor Americans was minus 13%. Can it be that nothing had changed? This book is about the answer to that and related questions. What really has been happening to the poor, to the disadvantaged, not just since the Great Society, but since mid-century? What are the facts about poverty and the phenomena we have corn to associate with being poor: crime and family disintegration and illiteracy and chronic unemployment? What are the facts about inequalities between blacks and whites? Are things better or worse or the same? What have been the trends? The answers are complicated by the fact that our goals kept changing. Americans in 1950 were not simply blind to the existence of poverty and discrimination. They also had very different perceptions from those of Americans in 1981 about the nature of poverty and inequality, about their causes and cures. Indeed, our policy toward the poor and blacks was by 1981 almost the opposite of our policy in 1950. What happened to them is inextricably linked with what the larger society decided to do for them, or with them, or to them, depending on one's view. We begin with that story in Part 1. Notwithstanding these changes in objectives, however, we shall be able to apply some stable measures on the fundamentals of daily life: jobs, income, education, the family. We have the advantage of some broadly shared conceptions of what constitutes progress, and some widely accepted official statistics for measuring them. We shall trace the status of the poor and disadvantaged on these criteria over the 31-year period from 1950 to 1980. Part 2 presents those data. To a certain extent, we also can address the more difficult question of causes. The corning of the Great Society triggered intensive research into questions of poverty and discrimination. All of the social science disciplines participated. Some of the research was tendentious, some of poor quality, but there remains a large body of useful work. We know much more than we knew 20 years ago about the real-life consequences of alternative social policies. Part 3 examines this work. The complex story we shall unravel comes down to this. Basic indicators of well-being took a turn for the worse in the 1960s, most consistently and most drastically for the poor. In some cases, earlier progress slowed. In other cases, mild deterioration accelerated. In a few. Prologue. Instances advance turned into retreat. The trend lines on many of the indicators are literally unbelievable to people who do not make a profession of following them. The question is why? Why at that moment in history did so many basic trends in the quality of life for the poor go sour? Why did progress slow, stop, reverse? The easy hypotheses, the economy, changes in demographics, the effects of Vietnam or Watergate or racism fail as explanations. As often as not, taking them into account only increases the mystery. Nor does the explanation lie in idiosyncratic failures of craft. It is not just that we sometimes administered good programs improperly, or that sound concepts sometimes were converted to operations incorrectly. It is not that a specific program, or a specific court ruling or act of Congress, was especially destructive. The error was strategic. A government's social policy helps set the rules of the game, the stakes, the risks, the payoffs, the trade-offs, and the strategies for making a living, raising a family, having fun, defining what winning and success mean. The more vulnerable a population and the fewer its independent resources, the more decisive the effect of the rules imposed from above. The most compelling explanation for the marked shift in the fortunes of the poor is that they continued to respond as they always had, to the world as they found it, but that we, meaning the not poor and UN disadvantaged, had changed the rules of their world, not of our world, just of theirs. The first effect of the new rules was to make it profitable for the poor to behave in the short term in ways that were destructive in the long term. Their second effect was to mask these long-term losses, to subsidize irretrievable mistakes. We tried to provide more for the poor, and produced more poor instead. We tried to remove the barriers to escape from poverty, and inadvertently built a trap. The final chapters, Part 4, take up the extraordinarily difficult question of what to do. They urge that we think again about what our deepest ambitions for social policy ought to be, and what the constraints surrounding helping really are. A moral dilemma underlies the history of social policy from 1950 to 1980, an anciently recognized dilemma that in the enthusiasms of the 1960s we dismissed as fusty and confuted. It is indeed possible that steps to relieve misery can create misery. The most troubling aspect of social policy toward the poor in late 20th century America is not how much it costs, but what it